All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Gadfly with your host, David Rich. How are you? This is world-renowned anthropologist, PhD candidate in anthropology at University of Illinois. He's being modest. He doesn't think he's world-renowned, but in fact he is. Since I wasn't being playful. He's been to Italy and Vietnam, Central America, and he's found all sorts of cool stuff, and governments employ him to find, so that's world-renowned. It is. Anyway, he's been on my radio show several times. Always got a big turnout there. Wanted him on tonight to do, for this new show here. Sorry about the ad hoc studio here, but we're doing our version of Drunken History. It's Wasted Anthropology. So anyway, hi Jim.
Hi.
All right. We got our wine going.
Cheers.
Cheers. So, all right, let's start with the beginning. What got you interested in anthropology?
Just growing up, being interested in the supposed mysteries of the past, ancient civilizations, lost civilizations, pretty much the title of every History Channel program now. Just growing up, just always getting wrapped into these histories of the past and where we came from, and starting to kind of unravel some of those mysteries.
Unraveling the mystery, and all started with the Big Bang?
Right. Well,
It didn't.
oh, it didn't.
No. Anyway, that's pretty cool. Jim and I have known each other a long time, what, 89, I think we met?
Probably. Right. I was in high school still.
Oh, wow. And he recently, somewhat recently celebrated a birthday. How old are you now? 49?
Yes.
Yes, he's 49. Anyway, all right, so it's always fascinating talking to you, Jim, and I want to know more about your adventures in anthropology. And why don't you go ahead and start with the actual schooling itself, the education. Like, what kind of stuff, briefly, do they teach you?
Well, in the modern university system, you go in specifically if you're seeking an anthropology degree or my pursuit is in archaeology, which is the study of humans, but through the material things that we make and do, and the landscape that we use. But for us in North America, archaeology is considered part of anthropology, so it's one of the 4 subfields of anthropology. So being in a North American university system, not only do you have to get your basic underpinning of a liberal arts education, knowing math, knowing English, knowing basic degree of how science works. It's once you start getting into a more graduate-focused career, the classes just become more and more specific, which to me seems always easier. Students always complain that an intro-level course should be a blow-off course, as many of them say, and they're really not, because let's say like in an introduction to anthropology course, you need to learn everything there is about anthropology in 16 weeks semester. But as the courses go on, they get more and more refined. And you start focusing on individual sort of components of anthropological thought. So in graduate studies, we do, there's cultural anthropology, there's linguistics, there's biological anthropology, and then of course archaeology. And we kind of focus on each one of those components separately, while eventually breaking off and honing on your one specific focus.
Is paleontology totally separate?
Yes, that is the study of ancient animals, and yes, it's not anthropological. So anthropological literally means the study of man.
Anthropocentric.
Yes, so anthropology is the science of, or something along those lines. But yeah, so paleontology would not be considered archaeology, since archaeology specifically is focusing on human-made things.
Human-made, like, so artifacts, stuff like that.
Yeah, and just the human world. And archaeology doesn't have to be about the ancient past either. It's one of the only ways we know about the ancient human experience, because the humans are gone, the language they might have been spoken is gone. In many cases, their bodies are gone. And all that's left are the material remains of the things they did and how they affected the landscape and how they affected the world around them. So archaeology is one of the only ways we can really tell about, in many instances, the ancient past. But it also informs today. I mean, we can do an archaeological assessment of this room because it's just the material remains and what they mean.
So you can look at the snow shovel and say, it snows here. Or you bought something you didn't need at all.
That's context is everything. The shovel in itself doesn't say that much. Where the shovel is says a lot. Because if you find that shovel in Phoenix, Arizona,
there's an issue.
There's a meaning.
Oh, all right. There's a difference.
Yeah, there's a difference. So context is everything. So an individual artifact removed from its context is almost useless. Some say, a lot of intro textbooks say that like an artifact removed from its context takes away up to 90% of its meaning and the information you can get out of it. So this is why looting archaeological sites is like a really major issue, because while these looters may be going and taking these artifacts, they take it in a way that we don't know anything about the context of where it came from, which is, again, the key to everything.
Yeah, so that's probably really unfortunate that people steal shit. All right, so real quick, Lou Bruno is watching. Hey, Lou, he's a buddy of mine from WRLR.
Hey.
Have you studied the work of Napoleon Chagnon?
Yeah, Napoleon. Only in passing, since, again, I deal more archaeologically, not cultural. Yeah, Napoleon Chagnon was a cultural anthropologist who is extremely controversial for issues I can't get too depth on because, again, I don't follow that field of study very often. But he got dropped into a group of a society in the Amazon that was not accustomed to having foreigners, specifically Westerners, in.
I'm guessing most small villages.
Yeah,
tribes.
Yeah. This is like a small, tribal society, and he essentially just kind of showed up one day and said, "I'm here to study you. Where do I live?" And they're like,
sounds like a typical like white European something or other.
Yeah, there's all these other. It's worth, if anyone is interested in cultural ethics or anthropological ethics, just type in Napoleon Chagnon ethics and have yourself a good deep dive because his project led to a lot of other projects of some questionable ethics. With medical experiments, like who controls medical and biological samples, like blood samples and things like that.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and again, that's something, since I sort of do deal with the past, I deal with kind of dead people, so it's a lot easier.
He says Yanomami Indians, is that right?
The Yanomami, yeah.
I can't see it.
The Yanomami in the Amazon. He wrote a very famous book, which is still taught today, called The Fierce People. We're trying to read your comments here.
Lou is saying, Dave, I knew he and his son, and there is a debate that ultimately was resolved in his favor.
Right, and again, I don't really follow that. I just know that he is extremely controversial. And let alone the ethics alone, my only comment on, the kind of the works on him or people sort of like him, is that he went into the society at a time and he published about them in a way that was very static. He kind of went into this group and was like, oh, they're doing all this stuff the traditional way and they're just a traditional society. And that word means almost nothing, because
lots of different traditions out there.
Yeah, traditions change all the time. People are always changing. They're always moving. Perhaps their societies aren't as complex as ours. That's definitely true. But he kind of presented and writers like him presented these groups in just very static, old-fashioned terms, which may or may not be problematic in the world today.
Okay, Lou, are you making a joke because of modern day stuff? think there was an issue of vaccination for tribal members, or is that legit?
Yeah, no, that was
Okay.
one of the issues of either forced vaccinations or there was definitely some medical ethics that were going on with him and or projects that followed his research in their tribal area.
Okay,
yeah.
cool.
So again, I don't really follow that very much.
All right. Well, then talk about, you went to Central America and did a bunch of stuff. Talk about that.
Right. Well, I got my archaeological training while I was still an undergrad, actually. So I never picked up a trowel in my life archaeologically, and yet one day I found myself in Belize working on a project that was run by a professor from Northwestern University in Evanston. And long story short, I was given a clipboard with some forms, given a crew, pointed to the top of a temple. That's yours. Go over there and start that project. And it's like, oh, looked at my Belizean buddy, guys, and you guys know what you're doing? They're like, no problem, Jimbo, let's go. Like, all right, okay. Up the hill we went. And so essentially I got my start doing archaeology, excavating classic Maya temples and everything that they can inform us. So I did that for 3 years. And again, I thought that was my trajectory ever since me and David knew each other back in, my early or late high school days, and, wanting to get into this, the ancient cultures of the world. It's like, now I'm actually doing ancient archaeology and being trained how to do archaeology in these ancient contexts at the site in Belize. I very quickly started realizing that my crew was far more interesting than the temples that we were excavating. And especially my crew's relatives in the recent past, like their grandparents. Where did they come from? How did the Belizeans of Maya descent get into Belize? How long have they been there? Where were their grandparents from? What stories did they have? And so as much as I got into the field of archaeology to do classic Maya archaeology, as soon as I got involved, I started fading away and found a new interest in historical archaeology, which is archaeology of the modern time period, or of time periods with historical documents. So the colonial period, more or less. Yeah, historical archaeology is a whole different subfield of archaeology. And again, people in Europe do historical archaeology different than people in North America. There's some contention about the field itself, which is just this academic.
Well, can you explain that a little bit?
Well, yeah, because archaeology, historical archaeology, it falls under the field. Well, it's historical and it's archaeology. So archaeology is, we're talking about is the study of humans and human behavior through the material things that we make and the landscapes that we do them in. History is another way to kind of know the past, but history very specifically as a science is, the knowledge of human history, or I can't use history. It's the knowledge of human past based on the written word. Right? So historical archaeology in some cases just means text-aided archaeology. So ancient Greek, archaeology, so classical Greece archaeology, that could be historical archaeology, ancient Egyptian, even the Maya, because we do have a script for the Maya, even though it's limited. They do have texts that we can use to use as sort of an artifact class, because you have to understand just because it's written does not make it so.
Oh, that's true.
That's just a whole nother, yeah. So much so that there was a professor from Michigan who once said that all writing is propaganda, which I've always enjoyed.
Did he write that down?
It was a she, and yes, it was written down.
Okay, so.
Yes, exactly.
I got to point out contradictions.
Oh no, I don't think that was a contradiction. I think she knew what she was saying when she did that. But nonetheless, so historical archaeology could just be text-aided archaeology. But there was a researcher named Charles Orser who looked at historical archaeology in a different way, and specifically in North America. And to him, historical archaeology was this archaeology of the modern world, because it's historical, it talks about colonialism, but it also talks about these colonial time periods and situations in which most of the colonial world wasn't writing about themselves. The people that were being colonized were rarely writing about the experience of being colonized. You know, what we know of a lot of the early colonization, you know, into the 17th and 18th, 19th century, you know, we know about it from colonial records and colonial documents. So this man, Charles Orser, kind of developed this idea as a subfield, historic archaeology, again, being the archaeology of the modern world, sort of the archaeology of globalization. You know, it's also been called the archaeology of capitalism. And it essentially starts, you know, more or less with Columbus. Columbus comes into the New World at, you know, yeah, well, you know, so 1500 on, but at that time, you can't ignore the fact that not only did two different populations collide, but an ideology came in that very quickly transformed the world. And, you know, globalization as we know it, and sort of, it could be argued that the birth of capitalism itself happened in the Caribbean, as all these European nations were flooding into this area to use these different locations as resource generating locations. So it went from like what we would consider mercantilism into true sort of capitalism. So that's another thing. So Orser's theory, historic archaeology, is history of capitalism and how that affects people and how that has affected the world. Not in a positive or a negative way, but just simply, you know, a new economic system was being either thrust on people in the case of like slave and plantation societies. And that was sort of the birth of historic archaeology in North America, was looking at how, you know, the slave experience of colonization and how they were interacting with, you know, capitalism. And then you get to the groups of Maya that I look at in the 1850s, and how they were experiencing capitalism from the jungle, instead of it being forced on them like these slave populations. You know, they had a choice to engage with it since they were just living out in the woods. But they would go into these societies in Guatemala and Belize, trade, and engage on sort of capitalism on their own terms, and then just sort of retreat in the jungle. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, for sure. Do you know much about the currency of any of these civilizations, Maya, Aztec, anything like that?
Currency?
Yeah, like what would they use to trade for goods and services? Or would they just trade the things themselves?
Yeah, there was some. I mean, and that's not something of the ancient world that I specialize on. You hear all the time that the Maya, the Aztec, they used chocolate beans, cacao beans as a sort of currency. I'm not exactly sure how that plays out, but nonetheless, you would take this, you know, very fragile commodity, being a biological seed, or you know, the inner workings of a cacao pod, and you know, it could only be traded so long before it just fell apart. You know, it rotted because it was a biological thing. So that, to me, I always like to think that there was a great there was something lost in that form of exchange that we could use today. Because again, while these people would amass a great amount of this very rare commodity, they had to use it. So essentially, they drank their wealth in chocolate. Cool. But there was other things. There's you know, they would most of it was trade and barter. I'm not exactly sure we really understand exactly how those systems work, because when the Spanish came in, they very quickly eradicated all local forms of economic systems and imposed their own. There's some hints that the Aztecs, the way they were sort of moving commodities around the area that they controlled of their empire. Not 100% sure the validity of this, but I know I was exploring it when I was taking graduate level classes. But when they would conquer a new area, they would demand tribute of that area. So you had to bring tribute from this conquered area and bring it into the center core of the empire. But what they would ask of people were things that were not commonly available. So if they went into a desert, they were like, all right, you need to bring, you know, some black bear pelts and all these other things that weren't available to the people in the desert. So those people in the desert would be forced to trade their desert products with people in the mountains and people in the jungles to get the things they needed to then bring into the city for like a central tribute to the Aztec Empire. So it was forcing the outer periphery of their empire to trade with each other, to trade commodities, to trade ideas and other other things that people trade, I guess. But it forced them to get together in ways that I think is quite unique, if that's actually the case. But it's so very hard to look at economies in the past because it's hard to see how things were moving in the past. And this is where looting is such an issue, because when things are illegally removed from the ground, we don't know where they came from. So in some cases, what looters are really looking for are hieroglyphic pots from the Maya world that have hieroglyphic writing on it. And one of the more common things that hieroglyphic writing would talk about is who made it and where. So if they say it was made somewhere, but yet it was found somewhere very far away, that would be very important, more important than the base itself, but it would talk about those connections between those two places. But in the Maya world, where biological material or organic material doesn't preserve well, how do we see the effect of trade? Because you can only carry corn so far, and A, it's not going to preserve, but B, people are going to eat it, and plus the people carrying it are going to eat it while they're carrying it. So there becomes a limit of how far farming produce and things could move. So what else would they be trading? And that's
were like most households like kind of self-sustaining? Do they have their own gardens and that kind of thing?
Almost definitely, yes. There would if it was self-sustaining, or were they sort of like in wartime, America and the UK during World War II, where you had victory gardens where you're supporting yourself. Some of these might have been connected, or you were encouraged to kind of grow food for a community. But we do know that there were some items that were just ubiquitous in households, in ancient Maya households. One was obsidian. So obsidian is a volcanic glass. It's only made in volcanoes, and it is the sharpest substance known to humans. You can
sharpest meaning hardest?
Like you can get the blade so sharp when you make a fresh cut on a good piece of obsidian, you can get the edge of the blade down to something like 3 microns, which is like tens of times sharper than a surgical scalpel.
Really?
Yeah, people used to do eye surgery with obsidian because it makes such clean.
So why do they use it nowadays?
Lasers replaced it.
Oh, lasers, yeah, it can't be laser.
But obsidian there's only so many mountains that make obsidian, and yet it's everywhere in the Maya world. So that's one way we can tell trade of how this material that is only produced in, so the raw material is only made in volcanoes, which there's only so many of them. There's like 4 major sources of obsidian in the Maya world, and yet every household has tons of it. And now so early on in my archaeological career, I kind of started getting involved with the Field Museum. And while working at the Field Museum, we started using a lot of their high-tech gadgetry that they have. And some of their equipment they have can look at the elemental and compositional makeup of artifacts like obsidian. So we can test obsidian and look at the rare elements that are in, because every volcano is going to produce obsidian slightly different than like a fingerprint. And we can analyze it and see exactly where the obsidian is coming from. So we published several different papers about 10 years ago about the obsidian trade throughout Mesoamerica.
Oh, neat.
And where it was coming, when it changed, and why it changed is something we still haven't really come to understand, because for 300 years they're using obsidian from a volcano called El Chayal, and something happens, and all of a sudden for the next 300 years they're using obsidian from a different volcano. So something obviously is happening, and it's showing how trade networks are changing, how communities are reacting to other outside stimuli. Could be political reasons, could be warfare reasons, it could be economic reasons. But that's one of the key indicators of really looking at ancient Maya economies and seeing how things are moving by seeing, because if obsidian's moving that far, what else is moving with the obsidian?
All right.
Including ideas.
I'm going to get super academic on you.
Okay.
Ready?
No. All right, hit me.
As you know, I studied philosophy, and one branch of philosophy is called epistemology. Epistemology is concerned with what counts as knowledge. How do you know, strange enough, when you have it? What are the methods of obtaining it? There's all sorts of different theories on all this, right? Okay. Now, science wouldn't be science if it wasn't, aspiring towards knowing things. Agreed?
Agreed.
Okay. So in philosophy is different because philosophy is all abstract concepts. We start with concepts. Usually we start with definitions of something and we argue from there. Whether the definition is proper, if it is, what follows from it, that kind of thing. So it's different than like your typical empirical science where you dig something up and go, oh, look at this, let's figure out what this is. And the rigidity of philosophy and mathematics and logic and that kind of thing is not expected of the empirical sciences because it just can't happen that way. However, being a science, anthropology, archaeology, what sort of methods do you use? Like when you go into a site, what do you do?
Well, it depends what kind of site, where it is, how big it is, all the logistics of it. But there's more planning that goes into an excavation before excavating, and then after as well. I mean, that's a big study going on right now, is looking at these museum collections that were excavated 100 plus years ago, that have been sitting on the shelf because someone already studied it and did all the research on it. But now it's like, did they? So now we can go back to these collections, re-look at the collections, re-look at their notes, and re-evaluate. And again, that's science, right? It's continually reifying what we know, retesting, because science is wrong all the time, and science is the one. Well, but science is the one that tells it that it's wrong, because it's always
science. Yes, reinvents itself. Which is good. That's part of the beauty of the scientific method.
Yeah, that's the purpose of the scientific method. Yeah.
Yeah.
So. So that's it. So planning.
Getting fucking vaccinated. Go
ahead. What he said. Where are we going with that? So it depends on how big of a site you're looking at. If you're looking at a large Maya site, are you looking at a small village? Is your plan to look at one household? Are you just looking at a campsite?
Without written record, how would you? Because I took an anthropology class, Linda Ott. Remember her?
I love that one.
I love her too.
I need to find her again. She was one of my
Do
inspirations.
it, dude. Yeah, me too. She was fantastic.
Yep.
Anyway, I remember just going over like familial systems and different familial systems in different cultures.
Right.
And some of we're all used to our own. I have a mother, I have a father, I have a brother, I have a sister, I have cousins, I have aunts, I have uncles. Seems pretty intuitive, like that's how it will go, right? And I can't remember exactly like some of the different familial systems that different cultures have, but I remember being like, what? Like, how is this person your aunt, or whatever, what we would call an aunt? And is there any, without having written records, can you figure that stuff out?
It'd be hard. It'd be really hard, because how would you? And again, because these are just concepts that we just made up and we agreed to. The fact that that you have aunts on your mother's side and you have aunts on your father's side, and they're just aunts. That's just something we as North Americans just take for granted. Right. But in other cultures, it's like, no. What you call the person on your dad's side and what you call the person on your mother's side are completely different.
All right, that's
and that's just something we just make up and agree to. It doesn't change the biological connection you have between these people at all, no matter what you call them. But it just, and the roles that we put on these people as well. We put roles in and this is what's at stake in our society right now, right? What's a mother's role? What's a father's role? And do you need both of them in a family for it to work? And it's this whole idea of the nuclear family as being the way to raise children. It's like, we just made.
But we're learning nowadays that that's not the case.
Well, yeah, and this is something
now that we allowed for gay marriage and that kind of thing. We see that they can raise children just as lovingly as anybody.
Absolutely, because again, but it's hard for people to consider that there's other ways, since it seems, as you said, so natural. Right. And this is something we'll never know really about the past, because when the Spanish came in, specifically into the Caribbean, there was a lot of indications that a lot of the people that they encountered in the Caribbean had, more than two genders. And they saw these people with these third genders, and these Spanish people were just, and it was partially because they were also highly religious, but at the same time, they were just highly, even more so, just ethnocentric. There's only two genders according to them. There's this one and that one, and all of a sudden they see someone with a third one, and it was such a deviation of them. There's reports of them sicking dogs on these people immediately.
Oh, they're probably still doing that.
Well, they probably are, but they did it so quickly and so early that we just don't know, really. We're just now sort of picking parts of this, these elements of these third genders and fourth genders and stuff in the Caribbean cultures. And we do know them in a lot of Native American cultures, which some of these traditions still survive fairly strong, particularly in the Southwest, with third and other, fourth genders. Yeah, so it's hard to tell. It's almost impossible to tell these things without actually talking to people and or having some kind of records, because they're just these cultural ideas. And even if we see them written down in certain ways or represented in certain ways, it's really hard to tell a metaphor if you're not in on the metaphor.
Sure.
So if you just see someone drawing something, we may not know what they're actually referring to. Is this whole ideological concept of another gender or a different family structure.
All right, what about mothers? Or is that almost universally, are they like the caretakers of the children, say? Not specifically universal, but would you say for the most part?
Well, this is a non-professional opinion, since this is something I don't study professionally, but I would think so. But it's odd when you think about European royal families. It's really easy to tell who the mother of a child was, like for kingship purposes, right? But kings always pass down through, but yet in English, just like English specifically, the kingship always went through the king, through the male, which always just seemed odd to me, because there's always room for doubt in a way. I don't mean to be like cheeky, but so the other societies kind of realized this notion of, well, we know who the mother was because we just saw the kid come out of this person. So that's and they based their family lines on a very strong, matriarchal society. So yeah, but the mothering thing, I don't know. I don't even want to venture into that, because there are so many different ways to raise children. There's some biological things, right, that mothers can do that fathers can't do in the early years of life.
True. Suck on the teat.
Yeah. So that's, but a mother does not actually have to do that, right? There's wet nurses and other. Yeah. So, yeah, I am sure there's societies out there that the mother's role is not remotely close to what we would think of as what a mothering is. But again, that's not my specialty.
What is your specialty?
If I had any, again, I research historic, post-colonial societies in Central America. So colonial period ended in Central America in the 1820s with the Wars of Independence to get Spain out of the area. And a lot of anthropological research stops at that point. People are really interested in what was going on right before colonization. People really seem to be interested in what was going on during colonization. But that time period right after colonization, there's just not a lot of, at the moment, there's not a lot of academic interest. That's not saying there's none, but there's just not a lot of academic interest in those time periods until you get to very more recent sort of ethnographic, where you can actually talk to people and about their experiences and maybe like their.
So, okay, well, that kind of indirectly brings up an interesting question.
Okay.
The traditions passed down orally, like nowadays, if you went to an area, I don't even know which parts of Mexico or Central America would have been Mayan, which would have been Aztec. I don't have any clue. But let's say you go down to where the Mayans existed at one point now. Do they have like any sort of like sages, wise people that say that they know the history of it just from oral passing on?
Yes. In many different forms. Yeah, so there are still, like in the Guatemalan highlands, there's what we would popularly call shamans. They do still exist. They call day keepers in English. Yeah, so they're very common. I worked on a project in Peru, and our project had, we hired a shaman to be like a member of it. Like we sort of had to. We had this gentleman that it was brilliant. He would come and we were up on a mountain and we had this massive ceremony to kind of give back to the mountain before we took from the mountain.
Nice.
Yeah, but this was also a very extremely spiritually charged location that had a very ancient component to it, but I don't think the modern society, I don't want to say they didn't care about the ancient portion of it. They knew the ancient portion of it, but to them that added some of the, like, the mystique to that location and that mountain, the apu of that mountain. Yeah, so we had a shaman. He was great.
That's cool.
And I would see him up there doing other ceremonies for other people. One day, it was brilliant. It was on the solstice. We're excavating away in our little pit, and all of a sudden we just kind of look up and we see a bunch of locals doing a ceremony, and they kind of see us on the other side of the mountain, and they kind of ask if we want to join them. And we're like, oh yeah, you know, get out of work for a little bit, see what you guys are doing. And that's when we saw the Yama sitting over there. And we're like, oh, what's going to happen to Mr. Yama there? And
Yama's the shaman?
No, Yama is the animal. You know, like a Yama, a llama.
A llama. Thank you. Okay. I'm sorry.
Yes. The world pronounces it Yama. Americans pronounce it llama.
That makes sense.
But yeah, the animal, like an alpaca, but the scragglier version. Long story short, they sacrificed it and drained all the blood out of it and threw blood all over this mountain as we're all just watching. And just like,
interesting. Wow.
This is the coolest thing. And they like invited us in. There's like photos of us, like, you know, they were passing on this incense bowl for us to, like, everyone in turn as this community. We're like, you know, giving prayers, almost like a Thanksgiving. But there's, instead of like us where we're kind of like Thanksgiving is tomorrow, right? Instead of us being thankful for things we had, and like they were more kind of thankful of the things they would kind of get in the future. They were like paying a little penance, like we're doing this now for some good benefit.
Good idea.
Yeah, giving a little bit before you get. And not
well, thankfully, so. Jesus is the final blood sacrifice for all people and animals, right? Anyway. It's my show.
Oh, it's his show.
That's very interesting. Like, I would love to know more about like the religious systems of these respective cultures. You know, I'm big into like ancient Egypt. More, you know, I mean, everybody knows like I'm, you know, into the occult and stuff like that. I've been studying the shit since I think you and your crew and like Zurich kind of got me into it, and I haven't really.
Well, that's our fault.
No, I love it. Are you kidding me? It's fucking awesome. It's completely defined my life since then. And
glad I had to part with that.
Yeah, for sure. You know, being involved in the Temple of Set being an Egyptian god, learned a lot about Egypt then. I just recently bought an Egyptian tarot deck, which has all the gods and goddesses, and it's fucking badass. Egypt is a fascinating, probably like as far as like high profile ancient cultures go, probably the most high profile. Right, I mean that's kind of easy to say. I mean, right, wrong, or not, but I mean, or indifferent. But I mean, like that's
the pyramids are the only of the 7 wonders of the world still standing. So, yeah.
Oh no, I guess that's true.
Yeah. And we are closer. How does this work? We are closer to Cleopatra in time than she was to the pyramids.
Wow.
I mean, that's how ancient the pyramids are. Yeah. And archaeologically,
some are even debating that it might be like, how old are they according to you guys?
To me, wait.
Anthropologists, archaeologists.
I think the accepted date for the Great Pyramid of like Khufu, that whole thing, I think it's 4,000 BC.
Yeah, okay. So there's some people that are saying that it's actually more like 10.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not going to aliens quite yet. I'm still a little baffled how they built them.
It's stacking rocks.
Big ass motherfucking rocks.
It's rocks.
No, it's rocks. What does that mean?
It's rocks.
And doesn't the stone from the pyramids come from like a quarry like way the fucking far away?
Yeah.
They get them up there.
Boats and a lot of people pull.
Okay. I'm not advocating for aliens. I want to know how it happened.
Well, again,
is it recorded?
That's debatable. There's some images of it, but generally speaking, no, it is not.
Because the Egyptians seem to record everything except for their failures. I
don't think building the pyramids was a failure.
That's what I'm saying. It's like, why didn't they record that? Like, as far as I heard this somewhere. It could be total bullshit. That they didn't, like, when they lost a war, they didn't write it down or something like that.
Oh, well, yeah, or they tell it in different ways. The Battle of Kadesh has been told so many times, which is this big chariot battle, the largest chariot battle that ever happened in the ancient world, or I guess modern world. Yeah, but I mean, we tell our history the history we know of, like, say, the Vietnam War.
Right.
I think your average, and maybe even not so average American would tell it very different than how it happened. It's the
Gulf of Tonkin, that whole thing. Turns out that they didn't actually shoot at a ship. It was all bullshit. And the military came out not too long ago and said that. It was all bullshit.
Well, the Nixon
flags.
It's very clear, I believe, in those that it's or was it? I don't know, but it is recorded, yes, because I mean that happened way before Nixon. But they were talking about it on those tapes. It is recorded about how that whole incident was, if not fabricated, how it was blown out of proportion. But yes, besides that, how we got into it, but why we were there, what was happening there, the tactics that were happening there, why did we pull out? Why were we there in the first place? Again, the story of it is just changing over time, especially in the past few years. Even the whole story of the Vietnam War, from right or wrong, vilifying the soldiers in the 70s when these people came home to now
they can't do anything wrong.
Absolutely not. They're veterans and they were defending the right of America somehow by fighting this war in Vietnam. Well, it's just complicated. But my point on that was not to make one statement one or the other than the viewpoint of that very engagement is changing completely as time goes on. Without any real deep analysis of what was going on there and or who was responsible, that almost doesn't matter. It's just what it sort of means now that it happened at all has it just changed. So again, you have the same thing, and just because you write it, like in ancient Egyptian times, once they wrote something, again, it doesn't mean they were writing real history. Writing is propaganda. And again, when you write it down, that's, I mean, as a musician too, you should probably know, like the old blues traditions, that there was countless versions of these songs until someone recorded it, and then they locked in that one version of that song. Now everyone that sings that song copies, generally speaking, that one
and they get the credit for,
like, in a lot of cases, yeah. But again, writing it just kind of sets this narrative and sets sort of a precedent for people to go back to understand that, because it is a point of information that we can go back and learn about the past. And maybe it's fair that we just reinterpret events, even like the Vietnam War. Maybe it's fair that we completely reinterpret what we were doing there, what it meant in more modern times. Make sense of it. So yeah, writing is very strange.
It's one of the things that actually kind of separates human species from just about every other one. No other animal species that I know of writes. They communicate.
They do communicate, and they do.
There's even evidence and studies done that plants and trees communicate with one another through chemical interactions and stuff like that. Sure. As far as like writing stuff down.
Writing's a tough one.
Writing's a tough one. It's definitely, and where it came from, where it started, that kind of thing, why we had developed it in the first place, and it's very interesting stuff. Which I need to.
Right. Early writing, and if anyone's interested, early Mayan hieroglyphics are hieroglyphics.
Hieroglyphic just mean picture language,
more or less. Yeah. But it's mostly used in incorrect way. Like Maya writing is not necessarily completely hieroglyphic, but that name stuck just because of bad stuff in the 19th century, and it just stuck. But they're like the Chicago Archaeological Society is hosting a presentation December 5th, I believe, the first Sunday of the month, and it is a presentation is by Dr. Mark Zender, who is a Maya archaeologist who studies hieroglyphs, and it's all about how hieroglyphs, while hieroglyphs had been functioning in the Maya world for a while, I think the title of his paper is How Hieroglyphic Writing Got to the Yucatan, so like northern Mexico, and like, you know, where Cancun and that area is. So how hieroglyphs got there and how it affected that society, so on and so forth. It's a free lecture. Mark Zender is an amazing scholar and researcher. It's actually going to be a really good talk. I highly encourage people to look at the activities of the Chicago Archaeological Society.
Well, that's really interesting, man. I would love to have like a anthropological linguist guy on my show once to talk about that stuff, because you think about hieroglyph, which is a pictorial representation of meaning instead of letters combined together to make a word, which is not, it's not a picture, it's not an image, it's just the letters. And the thing is that, like, again, like studying, you know, with, you know, the Temple of Satellite stuff, these guys were all over that shit. And they talked about how about like there's a lot of like mystery involved there, because like one picture can mean a lot of different things. Kind of like in what was it, one of the Hawaiian languages, like one word for no. Was it like 500 different meanings of snow or something like that?
Yeah, that wouldn't be Hawaiian, but
what was it? Polynesian?
Yeah, one of the, well, for snow, that would be like Inuit or something like that. Right. No, it wouldn't be the Hawaiian.
That wouldn't even make any sense. What about, there's got to be snow on top of the mountain somewhere, no?
Right, not in Hawaii.
Okay, cool. Anyway.
But yes, writing is, I mean, all writing is all completely, even like what we consider our, you know, writing with letters, you know, we just have an alphabetic system where we just have this weird squiggly thing that we just all agree is a sound. Right. And then you put that.
There's no doubt that it's somehow culturally arbitrary.
It's just like spoken language is all 100%. We just understand that the word book means this book, you know, like what a book is, right? You know, it's just a sound that we give meaning to. And that's like, yeah, when you get down to like linguistic anthropology, that's sort of where its sort of roots are. And especially when you start doing comparative stuff like between alphabets and like the Maya, you know, because the Maya had, their system was really crazy, and it looked really crazy because it was so artistic. But once you knew what a symbol meant, no matter how artistically drawn it was, it just meant that. And they wrote, largely they wrote in syllables. So we write in sounds, like one letter means like, it doesn't really have a meaning other than like a letter, like S, T, you know, or like those sounds. The Maya would write in syllables, much like Japanese, Chinese, Cherokee. When they speak, they put words together, not by these individual sounds, but they put, largely they put syllables together to make words. So we have an alphabet, they have a syllabary, where they have a symbol means a syllable. So then you just put all these like funky images together to make a Maya hieroglyph. It looks all crazy just because we don't understand the system, but it's just each little component of the symbol is really just, in most cases, a syllable.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, it took a Russian guy to figure that out.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Yuri Konorsov, one of the great, for a long time, unspoken heroes of the archaeological, anthropological world. But since he was working, and what made him even more amazing is that he did all of his work from behind the Iron Curtain, not connected into any of the research that was going on really in Central America because of the Cold War, or working with colleagues in Europe or North America. He essentially just had a couple texts and just sort of figured it out one day. But because of his connection to, you know, because he was in communist Russia at the time, a lot of North American scholars actively ignored all of his findings, which was horrific because it was just based on he's a communist or capitalist, so obviously he's wrong. And it was, yeah, so there was another great Mayan archaeologist guy named Michael Coe, who was the director of the site that I work at in Guatemala, Tikal, for many years, and he read that guy's report and he was like, how come no one is picking up on this? Yeah, everyone
stopped.
And, so academically, these scientists that were sort of against Yuri's work were picking apart the few things he was wrong about, which, again, it was an initial kind of paper to crack the code, the Maya hieroglyphic code. And he was wrong about some stuff, but he was also right about far more than he was wrong. And the overarching concept of this whole syllabary, is undeniably one of the greatest achievements of Mayan archaeology in the 20th century.
That's great. That's very good.
Yeah, and it was a guy that only stepped foot in Central America once.
Okay, see, you never know.
Right? And he found his first hieroglyphic text, apparently. He was a linguist, but he got wrapped up into World War II, as most people in Russia and Germany and that area of the world were. He was conscripted, forced to fight in the Red Army. And as the story goes, I believe he was in Berlin at the siege of Berlin, and being an academic, once he saw like the library on fire, he was like, oh, I'm going to go check over here. And kind of went into the library and went into the basement of some great research library, and floating by him in this flooded room was a copy of what is known as the Dresden Codex, one of the ancient Maya hieroglyphic texts. And the story is he took it home, and that's what he used to
That's cool.
form the basis of his kind of thoughts on breaking the Maya code.
Maya code has been broken.
Largely, but there is a lot the Maya did write, kind of like we do. They write in metaphors a lot, and that's. I don't think we'll ever crack it 100%, because some things are just lost in a metaphorical system that, again, if you're not in on the joke, you'll never get a metaphor, unless we can find it in other ways through pictures or things like that. So, but yeah, there's.
Do you know anything about like how they would use medicine? What kind of medicine they would use? Like, I always wonder that, like, with all the modern day medicine we have now, like, our survival rate, our mortality rate has gone up some on average. Not, I mean, like when you look, Socrates died in his like 70s.
Yeah, he was also very rich, so he was from this. Well, he was from a very elite, protected class, and while he might have lived into his 70s. Look at the average Greek person at that time. They were probably into their 40s, maybe 50s. Again, not my specialty, but I would. So yeah, I mean, think in modern terms, yeah. I mean, well, especially with the invention of antibiotics.
Sanitation and antibiotics seem to be the two biggest things as far as like accruing greater longevity and living.
Stopping communicable diseases, kind of like the virus that's going on now, things that are spread by close distance, and how to understand that and stop that. And I don't understand how that's now politicized. But
that's how so many people are just baffled. How this comes.
I don't know. They figured it out a couple hundred years ago.
You all got vaccinations before you entered school when you were a kid. Okay.
No one has polio anymore. That's
I wonder how that happened. Anyway, but I mean, it just I don't know anything at all about, ancient medicines or healthcare or anything like that. But like, you figure, people got sick, like was the mortality rate super huge? Do you know anything about like the Mayan mortality rate?
It was pretty low. I don't know offhand, but yeah, I mean, you would have the elite at times, because we had hieroglyphic writing, for example, of one of the great kings of a site called Palenque in Mexico. And there was a hieroglyphic writing of him talking about him being over 80 years old. And lo and behold, they found his tomb eventually, and they were like, oh, and they looked at the bones and like, oh yeah, this is
the bones.
Look at the bones. And lo and behold, yeah, the bones looked like an old man. So but again, it's good to be the king, as Mel Brooks once famously said.
Everything's so green.
Everything's so green. Yeah, I'm sure the Maya kings were saying that too, looking out over their jungle empire. Well, just as a jungle, I don't know. They had their own entertainment chemicals, I guess. But yeah, so again, the elite will always live longer than the poor. But I mean, there's instances of like, people in the Stone Age, where we have what's called trepanation. Where we have their skulls and they're doing brain surgery. And they're literally cutting the skull to either get in the brain or alleviating pressure on the brain. I don't know if they're doing this for physical reasons, for concussions or other things like that, which again, one thing you do, you cut, because the skull is a compact system, open it up, you let the pressure out. Or are they doing it to let spirits out?
Right, exactly.
Well, but we know that they're doing this. And again, any Google search can look for ancient trepanation. It's shocking how common it was in these ancient societies. And yet you look at the bones, they healed. These people, they did this in the bone, because bone isn't, we have this thinking that bone is just a solid thing, but bone is a living thing in our body, and it grows and heals. And we can see all these holes in these people's heads, and sometimes people have many of them, and sometimes they're huge in these ancient societies, and yet the bone healed, or was in the process of healing as when the guy finally died. So they knew something.
Yeah, and I wanted to I would love to learn more about the herbs and stuff like that they use for medicine and stuff like that. I mean,
Yeah.
You could have died from a mosquito bite, back then. I guess you could now, but I mean, it's a lot less
dengue is not fun. From experience, dengue is
so
not fun.
It's hard to imagine, but the hour already flew by. There's literally 3 minutes left.
Yeah. Here's up.
Can you at all talk about the difference between? Okay, so ancient Egypt was known for magic. They had magic involved. Their religion was based. No, I wouldn't say based on it. Magic was a big part of it. You could incantations and spells and stuff like that.
And Christianity isn't?
Well, no. Okay, I'm not saying it derogatorily.
Well, I know, but I'm just saying
No,
all of them. No, I'm not being defensive. I'm just like they all are.
Well, I mean, I guess they would say the Christian would say there's a miracle and magic, and I would say, by definition, okay, a miracle is something that God does. Magic is something that happens from the underlying fabric of the universe and the power thereof. Let's say that's kind of
okay.
Okay, but anyway, so do you find that sort of thing involved in other cultures? Was there magic instead of say just gods doing shit?
Every culture does magic.
Okay.
We do that. Again, we were talking about that article called Baseball Magic. When baseball players, rub themselves in certain ways or wear hats that they won't wear, they'll what's a famous guy? He would eat a chicken dinner before every game, That's magic. If we saw that in ancient context, we'd be like, oh, look how magical and simple these people are. But these it's the exact same thing. They are doing something in the world today to get some kind of effect known. And the more random of the event that they're trying to control, the more systematic their magical practice is.
That's right. The greatest definition of magic is from whom? Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, Crowley.
And magic is the art and science of change in conformity with one's will. That's all it is. And we do it all the fucking time. Watch.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a simple form of magic, but nonetheless one.
Right. But again, we have this look that when these other people do it, it's somehow simple and magical.
Right. It's primitive.
And we look at Maya art and we see these images of these gods and they're doing something. They look all crazy, all this story. But yet, I could tell you that another story in our society where some guy in a red suit with some white fluffy things is going to fly through the air dropping toys. When the alien anthropologists come down to study us, they're going to look at things like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Santa Claus and these things that we all know about. I could show you one image and you can fill in the entire story. But are we seeing that same thing in the ancient societies? These ancient things that the Egyptians were.
Sort of tolerance.
Yeah, or just that same thing. So what you're saying is how magical the Egyptians were. What if it was just some weird Santa Claus-ish type story?
I'm just saying that they're known for having magic.
And again,
Isis was the goddess of magic.
Right, and Santa Claus is the god of giving kids the toys.
Okay, cool.
Or toys to kids. Whoa, the wine is kicking in.
What was his name? What's the anti-Santa? Crocus? Krampus. He would give kids to toys, if you will. And he will. Nice. All right, it's actually 8 o'clock, but I want to ask one more question.
All right, here we go.
archaeology is kind of I want to say self-negating, because there's only so much archaeology to do. Would you agree with that? What's the future of archaeology? Like, where is it going? What's the big thing? You know, philosophy went through its, epics, like this was a big deal. Right now, it's all about human consciousness. Philosophers are trying to figure the fuck out what the fuck the mind is. Psychologists don't know what they're talking about. That kind of thing. Where is archaeology and anthropology now, and where do you think it's going?
Well, it's going two places. One, the same old place it's always been, which is why I stopped doing classic Maya archaeology, because, as I said, I started my research on a Maya temple, learning about Maya temples, just like every other Maya temple that's ever been studied. It's like, it's just a sort of repetitive. It's like, oh, they found another royal tomb. Great, what'd they find? A Maya king with some fancy stuff. And while that's neat and it's cool, it does add to our understanding of how things. It's not really adding new avenues of understanding. And I think that's where archaeology is going to move in the future. And only because you put me on the spot and I haven't thought about this before, but one way, and it's something that I've been working on in my dissertation that I'm trying to write about a group of Maya refugees from the 1800s that left Mexico and moved into Guatemala and set up this small sort of autonomous village in the jungle. But learning about that, if we didn't have the historical writing about that village, so a bunch of gringos saw that village and were like, hey, look, there's refugees there. They called them refugees. They said where they were from. So we know something about them. If it wasn't for that, all we would know is, oh, look, there's some English ceramics here. There's some metalware. There was obviously people tapped into European economic systems here, but we wouldn't know who or what they were doing there. But now we know they're refugees. So now we can look. And one thing that I've been doing, and I'm trying to, this is like sort of the last part of my dissertation I'm writing, is now, since refugees, I mean, there's 10 million plus of them in the world today. It is a form of human behavior. And it took anthropology a long time to really realize that. There's like, refugees are just never going away. They're always there, especially, and it's only going to get worse as time sort of goes on. But long story short, we can now look at like the refugee experience of the past and see how those people coped with different sort of aspects of the refugee experience, and possibly find correlations into kind of refugee movements that are going on today.
Interesting.
And I know we're out of time, but I mean, I found a couple just in my little village that are relevant to today, or at least are like they show very similar behaviors between refugees today and refugees of the past.
So like the local villages, whatever, saying, no, you can't come in.
Well, it's more about like refugee behavior and what they're doing. So long story short, again, I'll try to make this very swift. There was a researcher who looks at refugees in Tanzania. She was looking in I think the 90s. Her last name is Malki. And she was noticing that when refugees were forced to go into refugee camps, so they were removed from their homeland and brought somewhere else, but were forced to stay in a camp, they, had the ability and strove actually to keep their ethnic identity. It's like, we are this group, we have these shared experiences. Now. Yeah, you see these refugee
We're
camps.
Americans.
Or like, the Palestinians and all these other groups but they're in these things, and the shared experience of being a refugee and going through that experience is also feeding into their identity. And they're kind of keeping that whole. Yet you take one of those families and remove them from that camp and put them into like a town or a city somewhere nearby. Over time, they start losing that hyper identity that they were keeping. And they slowly start not acculturating but they start sharing their idea of their culture with other people. Those people, they take on aspects of the culture around them, and they sort of lose that, like in many cases, that hyper ethnic identity, and they start becoming this more, of a cross-cultural sort of group, especially when children are involved, because then the children grow up, as opposed to being in this hyper ethnic group, like in a refugee camp, You know, they're growing up in this multicultural situation, and they're seeing how this all plays for good or bad. How, you know, I don't know if it can be good or bad, but nonetheless. But I see the same thing happening archaeologically in the past. When the group of refugees, that the Maya that I'm studying, when they fled the civil war in Mexico, a lot of them went into what is today Belize, what was then British Honduras. And they didn't set up these refugee camps, but they just set up these towns and villages that were all organized as sort of mimicking the societies that they left in Mexico. And they stayed, you know, they stayed Maya. They stayed almost like Mexican Maya. They were seemed to be very proud of who they were. They were now tapped into this whole global economy of goods, but instead of, you know, getting all this new material culture and consumer goods, they were getting things that mimicked what they already had, specifically with their food, because a lot of Yucatec food is very soupy or stews, things like that. So like they were getting English, you know, ceramics and like, you know, Chinaware. But instead of getting plates and teapots and things like that that they never really used before, they got the deep bowls and big serving dishes and things like that that mimicked their culture. They're staying Maya, you know, and they did it so much so that the English eventually burned a lot of those villages out, and like, you know, just like, you just all need to go. That's a whole different story. Yet the people where I'm studying, which are likely associated with this group, they were a much smaller group of people, and they were living with 2 other Maya groups. So there was 3 different groups living together in a small village with a ton of children, half the village was children. So they're all learning from 3 different cultures of how to live out in the jungle. So they're already sort of melding together that way. And then all the English wear that they're getting, because they're leaving the jungle to go buy stuff from the English. But what they're getting is things that complement what they have, not mimics it. So they're getting teacups, they're getting teapots, they're getting plates, they're getting things like that. So they're sort of, you know, they're leaving their pure sort of ethnic core group of people, and they're forging sort of a new experience with new people, with new stuff.
That's what it's all about, man. Innovation, progress, evolution. I agree, 100%. Yeah, no, the whole idea for me, like, of culture and the cultural innovations, you know, food, art, language, ideas, whatever it may be, religion. These things are things to enjoy and learn from, you know, especially food and art. Oh my God.
Especially food.
Especially food, yeah. I mean, come on. No, I'm Italian. You think I'm just going to eat Italian food? No, I'm not going to have it.
Well, I mean, you can just look at all the innovations that the world brought to Italy. The tomato came from, you know, no tomato ever existed in Italy.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah.
Noodles came from Asia.
Right.
Hot peppers came from, you know, the New World. Yeah,
right. Yeah.
Everything's been opened up.
Horses were not native to North America. They were brought over from Arabia and Europe. But yeah, no, for sure. So, okay, I guess that we are well over time. Thank you for tuning in. I want to say one thing real quick, because we got a happy Thanksgiving here from Lou Bruno. For anybody who's like willing to dismiss tomorrow as some sort of like politically incorrect holiday, and I was the first one to dismiss July 4th and Columbus Day, and I think for good reason. Tomorrow, Thanksgiving, whatever you may think of it, it's one of the only times where the Europeans and the Native Americans actually got along, and to me, that's worth celebrating. Okay. Anyway, thoughts?
Oh, that's another hour right there.
It wasn't the time they got along?
Yeah, they did probably a good meal.
Okay. Well, okay. Even I don't give a shit if it's 5 seconds. You know, we got to embrace these things. All right.
Right. But it's also something that we can just be thankful.
There's also the thing that things just change over time. I fucking love Christmas. Okay, look, you see my little Satan tattoos? I'm not a Christian. Okay, and I fucking love Christmas. Christmas is awesome. You know why? Because the colors, the frivolity, the generosity, the charity, everybody like being in a very festive mode. It's fantastic. I don't give a shit if it has to do with Jesus or not. He wasn't even born on the 25th. It was a pagan holiday that the Catholic Church stole. He was probably born in April, if at all. Anyway, thanks for tuning into the what?
No, I was along for the ride on that one.
Thanks for tuning into the Gadfly, everybody. See you next time.